I'll share, as usual, I'll share something with you on what we're dealing with at the moment, or focus on a few of the things we're dealing with. But any questions you want on any topic is open. You're not restricted to what I say. So it's all fair game. But just in terms of our latest numbers, we'll send some more numbers through to you after. But as of this moment today, we're looking at 587 cases in Bristol, and we continue to. I'm a bit reluctant to say do well, because it's all a tragedy, but compared to the number of cases in other parts of the country, we continue to fare better and have a lower incidence. So let's hope that continues. Key areas for us today is obviously government has announced how that next tranche of local government support will be landing. We've received just under 13 million of that new tranche of government. Last time we had around about 13.5 million, so we've had less. There's a question to be asked there. And also the nature of the work we're doing on our economic recovery, which is an increasingly prominent feature in the coverage at the moment, but one we've been working on for 5-6 weeks ever since we began saw this building out. But I've been just share a few reflections with you. Firstly, we've been really trying to be clear on the nature and the scale of the challenge that we're facing, and just so we're fully prepared for this. First of all, this is the biggest global health challenge in a century. WHO was saying there'll be 3 million cases confirmed worldwide, at least 200,000 deaths in 213 countries. And obviously we are part of that. We are part of that public health crisis. Even when cases are not directly in Bristol, what we must recognise is that we have an international population whose families and friends around the world are being impacted by this crisis. So what happened, Bristol is not just what happens within its geographical boundaries. Our interests go across the world. So this is impacting the whole population. Secondly, what we have to recognise is that the actions we are taking to stem the spread of the COVID virus are going to contribute to the biggest hit on the economy since the Great Depression, 1929, 1932. The OBR, Office of Budget Responsibility, suggested GDP could contract by 35%. If the UK takes a hit like that, if the global, the predictions on what happens globally go the way as some economists are saying, this is going to be obviously a huge challenge to Bristol's economy, business and jobs, and you'll be covering that already. But we just want to emphasise this is, a challenge of some proportion. Add to the mix of that public health crisis and that threat to the local economy, the financial challenge now facing local government, who are already stretched. And Ebony Hughes, I shared yesterday, was writing in one of the local government publications over the weekend. Every recently approved medium-term financial strategy will need to go back to the drawing board. Authorities without healthy reserves will be worrying about being pushed over the edge. But even as those in stronger circumstances will be challenged by the prospect of setting a balanced budget for next year. Now, I would say, actually, in one of the points, the financial discipline brought in over the last 4 years with Craig and Denise has put us in a relatively strong position, but our position is nonetheless challenged. We estimate as a local authority that we've additional costs coming from COVID of in the vicinity of £29 million, covering adult social care, what we're doing around housing and emergency housing, the work we've initiated on domestic violence and child abuse, looking at our interventions around educational support. All those things that you've been writing stories about are bringing additional costs to what we do in the region of 20 million. I shared earlier on that we've just been told we've had just under 13 million in our settlement. Add that to the 13.5 million, you've got about 25 million has come from government. So the money they've sent us is inadequate to cover the increase in costs. And I've just come off a call. We had Steve Reed, the Shadow MHCLG Secretary, Liz Kendall was on there, Shadow Care Secretary, and Labour leaders from across the country. And this story is a common one, as well as frustrations with PPE and food distribution, the inadequacy of government finance, and the drive of national governments to control everything from Whitehall, causing bottlenecks in the structures. What I would say is and the very honest point made by Nick Forbes, who's chair of LGA, leader of LGA Labour and leader of Newcastle. This is not a uniquely conservative challenge in terms of centralisation of power, but this is what national governments do. But inadequate finance, centralisation and control is causing major problems in our ability to respond to this crisis. What government are not doing at the moment also is taking account of the lost revenue to local government. Our estimates at the moment that we have lost revenue of £80 million through this crisis. That's people not paying council tax anymore, lost council tax revenue, parking, where we own property and we rent it out, our business rates. And if those businesses do not come back after the periods of furlough, if people are permanently unemployed and no longer paying council tax and so forth, obviously there will not be a bounce back to make up for those holes that have appeared. That will be a permanent loss of revenue stream. And I think what government are doing is recognizing increased costs, but they're not grappling with the importance of local authorities raising revenue to cover the cost of core services now. This is a development in the financial situation of local government and national government has not kept pace with. So there's nothing about our lost revenues at the moment. So that's the nature of our challenge. Around that, you put these two things in place. Right? I'm going to give you two scenarios. Unemployment. At the moment, our unemployment is around about 4%, about 10,100 people. Some economists are predicting as much as 20% unemployment through this crisis, the top case scenario. 4% unemployment, 10,000 people. 10% unemployment, you're talking about 25,000. 20% unemployment, you're going up to 50,000 unemployed. Right? So I'm not scaremongering, I'm just saying what happens if you look at those percentages. You add the complexity to that unemployment in Bristol never falls evenly. Certain areas are disproportionately hit, as they are currently, by rates of unemployment. So that would not fall evenly spread across the city. Those areas, obviously the most disadvantaged now, would take the biggest hit from that. Add to that, when we talk about the importance of getting the economy going again, as well as those direct numbers of unemployment, the research from Business West that said that only 11% of businesses who employ between 5 and 9 people believe they can survive beyond 6 months of lockdown. And bearing in mind the lag time of any economic depression would be with us for some time. So what I've been stressing is when we talk about the economy, we are not talking about some abstract thing out there with big bad corporations coming and buying up all of our health services and so forth. There's an element in the economy that is true. But when we talk about ensuring that we protect our economy and protect our businesses, we are talking about businesses like those self-employed, those firms with 5 to 9 employees who work out of, are based in Bristol, who help people put food on the table. So this is our huge challenge. And you put a political context to that, adverse economic situations, you have a toxic environment for some very unsavory kind of politics. And we do know that there is some agitation going on, at the moment. Having said that, the nature of our economic recovery is something that we need to get on top of. And as I said, I've just been on a conference call with Labour leaders from across the country. And this is one of the areas that we've talked about. We are going to be working through Western Gateway, obviously Bristol ourselves, core cities. We are going to be making the case for 3 things to underpin our economic recovery. One is we want government to back our major infrastructure regeneration programs. They need to guarantee they're going to happen. They're fantastic local multipliers for the economy, and we can get our local supply chains around those. Temple Meads, the pedestrianisation of the old city, bringing forward the infrastructure on our bus deals, building sustainable housing, bringing forward our mass transit system. Secondly, we want government to, and actually I would just say that what we want is what we see the opportunities to bring forward green city regeneration, sustainable projects around transport and sustainable housing. It gets the economy moving, but it also gives us that green future. Secondly, we want government to back us on our city centres and our high streets. With people not going out to restaurants, with the nighttime economy under all sorts of pressure, retail was under pressure anyway, we need some kind of a real solid commitment that the government will work with cities and towns to ensure our city centres survive and ensure our high streets survive. Those those economic hubs that stitch communities together. And a few weeks ago, Secretary of State Hancock just announced the cancellation of debt for the National Health Service. We need the equivalent for local government. It was a quick statement, £60 billion of debt gone. Local government is under phenomenal financial pressure. We are an integral part of local service provision. We need that financial settlement with government to be reset. So we need the equivalent of the NHS debt cancellation for us. But what we've also talked about is in that economic recovery, we want this whole economic recovery to be built around the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 global sustainable development goals. This will bring together ecological emergency, climate emergency, inequality, political transparency, and openness and connectivity and health. All those things that make for a rounded economic development. And a form of development that will, one, increase our resilience as a city for the future and for future shocks, while simultaneously reducing the impacts we have on the planet, reducing the likelihood that we will create the conditions for future shocks, be they climate shocks, environmental shocks, or social shocks, that we end up in this situation again. So we're really on a track, and we're hosting a seminar within the next couple of weeks with City Brains and a few international guests about how we begin to reinvent the economy. We don't replace like for like. We cannot go back to what we had before. And while I'm loath to talk about opportunity in a crisis like this, because I think talking about opportunity with no regard to the suffering and the loss that's going on at the moment is distasteful, we nonetheless must take advantage of the doors that open right now to reinvent the way we do economic development. So that's something on our financial situation, what we're trying to do with the wider economy and the challenge we're facing. But the floor is yours for any points, questions you'd like to raise.
Well, I'll come in then. Marvin, you talked about levels of unemployment, predictions of, sort of 4 and possibly up to 20%. Have you got a sense of the scale in the city of Bristol at the moment? How many people have actually applied for universal credit since everyone was told to work at home? Do you have a sense of just how big where we're at the moment?
Yeah, we know, well, so one of the best indicators I could share with you is the rate of increase in people applying for the council tax reduction scheme. And as we've been sharing, that's increased 500%. I'll get the furlough numbers to you for Bristol. We can get those and send those to you after. But that rate of increase has just been incredible for us, as well as, and our team have had to work on making sure that those get processed. So we are seeing a change. That is a good indicator of the change in economic status of people in Bristol. That's probably one of the best we have right now.
I mean, and obviously that all happened, within a week. Universal credit doesn't come through immediately. There is quite a long delay in actually getting that. What advice would you give to people while they're actually waiting for cash to come through?
Yeah, so we've been, this is where, Jules, where we stepped up so quickly on food provision. And we already had that, fantastic citywide partnership to make sure no children were hungry, and the reorientation of that system to getting food out to vulnerable people. So people have been identified through the existing network of food banks and food clubs, but we've set up that emergency number and our contact email for people to reach out if they know of people going without food. So that basics is there, and obviously the provision around non-evictions at the time has come through nationally, which has been helpful as well. So food has been our real drive to support people. Universal credit, that's the case made by authorities across the country. They have to speed up the paperwork on that. And in the meantime, we've been telling people, reach out to us. If people are falling behind in their council tax, what we are not doing at the moment is hounding and chasing them as well. We've made that provision as well, and we won't be charging interest on missed payments, at the moment, as well. So we're doing all we can locally, but we need that finance released from national government so we can offer the level of support that the city needs right now.
And in terms, you mentioned sort of food access and food poverty. Where are we at with that? What's your sense of the sort of increase in demand in the city?
Well, we know it's going up. Again, I'll get some specific numbers for you, but I was out last week visiting some of our food clubs, We've had 4 new food banks open up across Bristol, 3 in the south, 1 in the north, and then we've had 11 new food clubs open up where people pay a nominal fee of about about £3 a week, £3.50 a week, and then get about 15, 16 quid worth of food. And they reported back to me that they've seen more people coming in to access those services who were saying, I never thought this would be me. I never thought I would be someone who needed support to get food. What I would say is with Feeding Bristol on that network, we have a very resilient network of food distribution in the city, because we've been doing it and developed such a good track record over the last few years. The challenge is that where some of the food banks were actually beginning to plan an exit strategy, and this is the conversation we had last week, they're now totally changing their strategy to say we need to plan the resilience strategy. What is our model of sustainability for the coming years? Because we're not going to be stepping away from the need for food banks for some years to come now.
What's your sense about for how long people and families of Bristol will be relying on food banks in order to feed themselves and their families?
Oh, I'd say for the foreseeable, because even if there was a V-shaped economic hit whereby we hit the bottom and then we bounce back quite quickly, which some people are forecasting, the social bounce back for ordinary people would not be that quickly. You don't just lose your job and then jump back into it. It's not like ripping a Band-Aid off, is it? There's all sorts of other things going on in our society right now, increase in domestic violence, child safeguarding issues, mental health, depression, anxiety, loss of self-esteem, relationship breakdown, that actually are contribute to that lag of any economic uplift being passed over to ordinary workers and businesses. So I think the consequences of this will echo for years into our future. Our job as a collection of city organisations is to just support people where they are dealing with whatever crisis they are in the moment, and then to be fully supportive in identifying and supporting people to walk along that pathway to restoration and recovery and restoration. But this is, that's why I said at the front end, just to set out the scale of this challenge. It's a once in a century challenge. Ironically, if I could just share in terms of preparedness for this, when we hosted the Global Parliament of Mayors in Bristol in 2018, we had 3 items that we discussed in this very chamber: the global migration crisis, urban security, and pandemics. And in that, you can see the papers about how the cities around the world were talking about pandemics in a way that perhaps national governments maybe weren't as proactive, but we were very proactive in talking about how cities dealt with pandemics. And at the time, it was really much seen as a kind of global south issue. And maybe some of the northern hemisphere cities didn't engage with it as much as it would. And I admit, it was unimaginable to me that we would face something like this. But it shows preparation and being ready for these shocks is a critical part of of what we do now as cities.
Marvin, I'm aware we've only got 4 minutes remaining. Ellie,
sorry, I don't mind hanging around because I was a bit late as well. So.
Okay, great. Ellie, do you have any questions?
We got to 1:15 apparently. So.
Oh, fab. Jules, have you finished?
I can go on there.
Jules has finished. Great. Ellie, do you have anything?
Yeah. Hi, Marvin. Thank you. I just wanted to go back. A couple of weeks ago, you mentioned that you and other core city leaders are going to be applying to government for, I think it was £100 million pot to help some of the businesses that are currently falling through the gaps in terms of support. I wondered if you've got any further with that, whether you've had any response.
Yeah, no, I haven't had a response yet. That was an idea that was being worked up. So that's the details around that are being worked up. It was an idea that came from the leader of Birmingham, Ian Ward. It's a fantastic idea, but before we go and say can we have 100 million, we have to take, put the detail together. So that's being done. What we have done, Ellie, is through the Western Gateway and obviously with the core cities as well, is just come up with that top list of the big regeneration projects that we can then use to make sure our local supply chain is benefiting from that investment and development that's going on. As soon as the work is done on that pot, we'll share it very widely.
Okay, thank you. And just to check I've got the figures right, so currently from government, Bristol's had just over 26 million, but is facing additional costs. Sorry.
In that vicinity, yeah.
And additional costs are currently at about 29 million, with an additional loss of revenue of 80 million.
Yeah.
Aside from asking central government for further support and to cancel current debt, what are you going to be doing to mitigate against the impact of this?
Well, so you say the balance on there is, and what I would say is these are scenarios that we run through, and this is the middle case scenario. You know, right. Not the best, not too hot, not too cold. It's the one in the middle. There is a worse scenario that people have played through. But we are looking at drawing on our reserves for this as well. Reserves are there for emergencies. This is an emergency, but that has knock-on effects. Also, it's one of the reasons why getting the economy moving is so important, because a moving economy generates revenue for the local authority that we then depend on for our services. Look, and to be perfectly frank, as I shared in the quote at the beginning, in the absence of a solution, it would mean that any local authority in that position would have to relook at all its financial planning, as a number of them are. A number of years ago, the comment in the face of austerity was local authorities around the country are looking around and waiting for someone to fall over and hoping it's not them, waiting for the first one to fall over and hoping it's not them. After 10 years of austerity plus this, we're in that situation with bells on. And like I said, we're in a relatively strong financial position, not because we've had adequate funding from government, but just because the way the money's been marshaled and managed has been good. But I think if you look around the country, there are going to be some stories of financial local authorities, potentially going to the wall. It's a very challenging time.
And I guess we won't actually know the full fallout until the furlough, because currently a lot of furlough schemes are keeping people in employment that at some point are not going to be there anymore.
I'm going to check this number, but I'm just going to check a number. Maybe Kevin, there was a paper, wasn't it? Was it 80%? There was estimates that the top end, the percentage of people on furlough who may not go back to employment.
Wow.
There was a figure which the two economists put together, which was between 50% and 80%. So it's quite a wide parameter, but it's a high number. So
we have this kind of moment at the moment where things are kind of in the air, but we don't quite know how they're going to land at the other end of it. That we have to to prepare for. I think one of my and again on the call with the leaders from across the country, one of the things I just urge government to do is just to be a much more dependable partner with us. Business needs certainty. This is a well-worn phrase through Brexit, but so do local governments. What I've just talked about and what we're looking at is how can we go on a 20-25-year city rebuild regeneration program, right? That makes us a low-impact city on planet resources, makes us a more resilient city, more inclusive. Does that, but you can't do that on 1 year, 2 year horizons of finance. We need a long-term financial relationship with us. In that sense, we can rebuild Bristol, we can get the economy going, but we can get the right kind of economy going. At the moment, it's very difficult to get a sense of where government are right now. It's on a promise. It's just spend the money and we'll be with you. And then there's another phrase that comes out that sounds like, well, maybe they won't be making the full recovery of the financial hit we're taking. We need certainty from government. And I'm not the only one who's just not feeling we're getting the level of certainty we need that will allow us to plan with confidence, not just how we deal with the immediate crisis, but how we begin to take the city on this 10 to 20 year recovery journey and restoration journey that we'll need to go on now because of this crisis, but we should have been looking at anyway in the face of the climate emergency.
Thank you.
Anyone else got any questions?
Yeah, if I may, if no one else will step in. I'm Marvin Adam here. Couple of questions. Firstly, on the temporary place of rest, Obviously, that's open now. I'm assuming it's not being used yet, and fingers crossed it won't be. Is that the expectation now?
Yeah, that is the the good news around that at the moment, is that we don't have an immediate need to use Sandy Park at this time. We are within the capacity of our existing provision. Clearly, Adam, there are pressures in the pipeline, mainly around funeral directors actually managing to undertake their funerals and get people buried and cremated. But outside of that challenge, let's hope that we can get through this crisis without needing to use it.
The other thing I was going to mention, just I suppose related to that, was the issue about cemeteries, which obviously a lot of people are upset about. When is that? Have they been opened yet during the more restricted hours, or is that over the next few days?
Thursday at 4:00 is the plan to open the cemeteries. 4 till 8 on a weekday, and 10 till 6 on weekends. We recognise so many of the interventions that we've had to make are, have a negative impact on people, and that's one that we had to make. But in light of where we are, hopefully this lifting of the restrictions will help. I just want to stress though that lifting was to enable people to go to the cemeteries to visit the graves of their loved ones and to mourn. We're asking people, if it's for the purposes of exercise and walking, please use the local parks so that we can protect the space in the cemetery for those people who are going there to mourn. So it's a collective ask, really, public service.
Sure. On that note, on the exercise, it's something you mentioned a few times now. I'm just wondering where it's come from, where the information has come from that people want to go to cemeteries to exercise, because it seems like quite an alien idea to me.
No, you do it near me in Greenbank Cemetery. It's quite quite popular. People, for a cemetery, it's green. It's it's a quiet place. There are open areas, and there's a paths around it. So yeah, people walk around it, and I recognise it's very popular for that.
Sure. Okay.
Adam, it's a question we actually have quite a lot on social media, even not in COVID-19 times. Is we do get a lot of complaints about people walking dogs or children in graves, and their parents allowing them to climb over graves and stuff, because they're not actually there for mourning purposes. They're there for leisure, I suppose. In the city centre, if you don't directly live next to a park, then it does offer you green space.
Okay. On the opening hours, if just last question on that, really, if the concern was that more people would go there to exercise, and it's obviously all about social distancing, as well as observing privacy for people visiting the graves of loved ones, if you're reopening the cemeteries with reduced hours, doesn't that surely create a greater concentration of people?
Well, no. This is leadership in that sense by consent in Bristol, in the same way as Andy Street would talk about the police. At the moment, we'd go on the fact that there's no one there, although we know people have been still visiting some of the cemeteries. There's no one there. This is just about making space for those people who want to mourn, and if we do respect that and go along with that, then we won't have a deluge of people. We'll just have people who need to be there.
Okay, thanks very much.
Also true, Adam, of course, they're only open on shorter hours because they're not open during the day because they can't clash with funerals. So
Yeah.
you could open them longer.
Anyone else got a question?
I'll just chip in at this point. We talked, Marvin, you talked quite openly about the sort of long-term projection on how the council is going to be potentially impacted by the COVID crisis. But I mean, how do you think the council is going to have to change in response to what's been happening and the services it's able to provide looking ahead?
So there are a number of ways in which that will play itself out. And now, clearly, if we look at it just in terms of the financial hit on the local government, and there being no and no government intervention, cancellation of debts, and support us with the lost revenue and so forth, clearly we'll have as an authority less money. You can't get stuff for free. That's a constant, that will have a direct impact on our service provision. So in that envelope, there's just a basic reality that we have to face up to. But we're not alone in facing that. With local authorities all across the country. In terms of the way we work, there's something that we started doing anyway through the city office that we would be wise to do even more of, and that is that partnership working and look at those interdependencies. So, one of the worst things we can do for city governance is just for the city council to just define itself simply in terms of the services it provides. We're an enabling organisation as well. We should be a development organisation. How do we work with the voluntary community sector? How do we work better with the health sector, with business, with the police? And those relationships we don't always get benefits from those relationships because we put money in. Sometimes the benefits to the city come because we just work better and we work more efficiently together. So that's going to be really important, thinking about city governance, not just local government in the future. But we're starting to look next week. We are going to be looking at the lessons we've learned about the local authority through this crisis. So every system in Bristol is being tested right now. Our waste system, education system, the political system. We couldn't hold meetings, and we held them virtually when we had the government provision made. Energy systems being tested, housing system. This is an opportunity to really learn about what makes a city strong and where its weaknesses are. That also runs similarly for the local government. The speed at which we've been able to get the grants out, we are in the top quartile of local authorities getting that government money out to business. What have we learned about the way we can act in a nimble, responsive, dynamic way within Bristol, and how our different directorates work and our teams work with each other, and the politicians work with the officers? So we're breaking that down, and that will feed back into Bristol City Council to shape the kind of organisational development journey we go on, over the coming months and years.
And just quickly, you talked obviously through some of the figures. It's a lot of money, obviously that's at stake. But based on your sort of current projections, how long do you think it's going to take for the city to recover from what's happened in the last few weeks?
So, I was going to step into the shoes of an economist.
Are we talking?
Yeah, no, I'm just being a bit because it's such a massive question. I mean, it's very difficult to know. This is going to take years, because the national numbers that often get reported go up, it doesn't mean that people are benefiting from that. And that's why I said you can have a V-shaped recovery with a massive dip and numbers coming back and wealthy people doing well, with lots of people on lower incomes being left behind and not sharing in any recovery. That's what we must avoid. So, and I think different sectors within the economy will recover at different paces: legal, financial, entertainment, tourism, nighttime economy, restaurants. They'll all cover at different paces. So there'll be a number of staging posts. To be honest, the best thing I can say to you at the moment, absence of my economist prediction PhD, is this is going to be with us for years, and this is going to echo for years. And recovery, again, it cannot just be defined in terms of what happens in the economy. The mental health consequences, the family consequences, the consequences of the domestic violence that we've been trying to tackle. That has to be counted if we're going to have integrity as a city. When we talk about recovery, we have to be talking about the recovery from all the consequences that have come out of this crisis and the conditions it's created.